Picture this, you roll out of bed in 2030, you wipe the sleep from your eyes and realize that that one lonely XRP in your forgotten hardware wallet is suddenly worth more than your buddy's brand new electric sedan. It sounds bonkers, right? But stick with me because today I'm going to be walking you through the boldest valuation study that I've ever read and why I promise it'll either melt your face or melt your skepticism. Now, last night, while everyone was watching reruns of their favorite sitcoms, I was nose deep in Valhil Capital's latest deep dive on XRP. Now, they dusted off something called the 𝗗𝗗𝘃 and Mitchnick model, and the long story short here, these folks think a single XRP could be chilling somewhere around $4,813 by 2030. Yep. You heard that right, $4,000 and change. Now, under kind of rosier assumptions, it's knocking politely on a $9,000 door. Now, before we kind of all quit our day jobs here and start booking first-class flights to Mars, let's unpack how they arrived at those numbers. First up, the model kind of flips traditional just look at the transactional volume logic on its head. Instead of kind of pretending that XRP is the only, or at least is only a grease for the wheel coin, Valhil actually stares straight into the mirror and whispers, "Store of value, baby." Now, in fact, they even weigh that store of value function as heavily as it kind of practically tips the scales off the desk. Now, the thesis is actually quite simple. Adoption kind of begets price, and price begets hoarding, and hoarding squeezes supply, and squeezed supply shoots price to the moon, right? Now, it's a kind of feedback loop, like a karaoke night where the worse that you sing, the more that you drink, and the more that you drink, the worse that you sing, right? Except here, each verse is hopefully a little more profitable. So let's talk about the numbers then, because you know I love a good old stat sandwich. Now, their conservative scenario, and yes, I'm using the biggest, boldest air quotes that you've ever seen, assumes that 10% of global cross-border transactions happens on the XRP ledger by 2030. So that's a kind of $700 billion a day market moving across the ledger at literally 1 second settlement speeds, right? Now they kind of lock the supply at 56.5 billion XRP, slap on a clean 10% discounted rate, and give the adoption story 5 years to kind of marinate. You stir all of that into an economic kind of casserole dish and pop it in the oven. And out comes that flashy $4,813 price tag. Now, here is where the story feels less like Wall Street spreadsheets and more like a Marvel origin montage, right? Now, Valhil introduces the kind of victorious kind of cycle flywheel, if you will. It's catchy, I'm sure. Just imagine a giant flywheel in an old mill, right? And the first kind of push takes serious muscle, but once it's kind of spinning, every little nudge adds more momentum. So in XRP land, that kind of first push is the adoption. That's more banks, more remittance companies, more aunties wiring wedding gifts across borders. Say, hey, this is cheaper and faster, and start using XRP. Now, the kind of wheel, it starts moving at that point. Price ticks up, and suddenly holding a little bit of XRP feels like owning kind of a beachfront real estate property before anyone else sees the potential. Now, hodlers, they step on in here, reducing circulating supply, liquidity tightens, and every incremental demand bump is kind of another muscle shove on that flywheel. And before you know it, XRP isn't just a settlement token, it's a digital Swiss vault. And by the way, if you want to kind of geek out about this stuff, or at least stuff like this, I should say, every single day, and you want to hop into our free educational Discord server, there's a link in the description. We have a corner called Model Munchers. We don't, but we probably should. Where people kind of could tear apart reports like this with all the enthusiasm of a cat discovering a laser pointer. Now, whether you're kind of a data scientist or just someone who likes yelling "when Lambo" into the void, you'll probably find yourself fitting right in. Now, let's go ahead and zoom out to that eye-watering store of value demand figure then. Right, Valhil's model toys with the kind of $530 trillion addressable pie. Let that kind of sink in just for a moment here. $530 trillion. Now that's the kind of number that you kind of read twice because your brain thinks that you just added way too many zeros. Now they're basically arguing that if a digital asset nails the perfect mix of speed, security, and real-world acceptance, well, global liquidity could pile in quicker than kids on an ice cream truck on a July afternoon. And if we dare to kind of stretch the envelope to a cool $1 quadrillion in dollars, store of value demand, well, the model kind of spits out prices that could make $9,000 look almost humble. Even in a kind of pared back $100 trillion scenario, we're still staring down at a $908 XRP. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds like a flex worth kind of jotting down on a sticky note for future bragging rights. Now, of course, models are only as good as their assumptions, right? Garbage in, garbage out. And Valhil kind of readily admits that they're not even including monster markets like derivatives or real estate. They're also, waving a polite white flag at future use cases and CBDC curveballs. So yeah, it's both bold and strangely conservative in the same breath. Right, kind of like someone showing up to a costume party dressed as a kind of hedge fund manager holding a sign that says, "But I could have been bigger." But let's get personal here for a second, because back in 2018, I bought my first batch of XRP, basically out of pure FOMO. Now, prices were tanking, sentiment was kind of worse than last night's leftovers, and I remember thinking, well, at least it settles fast. Now you can fast forward to today. The conversation has moved from it's quick to it could at least could this be the kind of backbone of global liquidity? And that's a pretty seismic shift, right? And every time that I try to explain it to my dad, who still wires checks, at least I should say writes checks at the grocery store, I kind of break it down like this. Imagine if the dollar, PayPal, and gold had a baby. XRP wants to be that baby. Now, Dad still kind of scratches his head, but he's at least kind of stopped calling crypto internet beans. But let's take a breath here and talk about bluffing. Because yes, that affiliate link that is in the description puts a little kind of wind in this channel's sails. So if you're kind of going to trade anyway and fancy kind of poking around an exchange that kind of prides itself on transparent fees, then bluffing is probably worth exploring. And full disclosure, every click on that affiliate link supports the channel and keeps my coffee cup topped up so that I can keep discussing gigantic valuation models with you guys. And back to the numbers here, one of the model's kind of secret spices is its single second settlement time. So let's think of that $700 billion flying around the planet in the time that it takes you to blink. Now, 1 second settlement isn't just a neat party trick, it's a fundamental capital efficiency game changer, right? Businesses can turn over funds much faster, treasuries can shrink idle balances, and foreign exchange desks suddenly look like Blockbuster in a Netflix age. So, the more that I kind of stewed on that, the more that I realized that we're not just kind of talking about a price chart. We're talking about a potential rewiring of how money itself actually circulates. And yet, here's the relatable problem, and it's skepticism. I ask a random friend if they believe XRP could eclipse $4,000, and you'll probably get an eye roll so aggressive that it kind of registers on the kind of, I guess, Richter scale, right? And it's fair enough because crypto has more hype cycles than Fashion Week, right? But remember when the first iPhone dropped and everyone said a touchscreen? That'll never take off. Humans statistically kind of stink at the exponential thinking. We're kind of linear by default, and charts that curve up like a ski slope kind of scramble our internal calculators. So Valhil's answer to that kind of psychological hurdle is the flywheel. Once people kind of witness a small but tangible demand-driven uptick, conviction kind of snowballs. So it's kind of like the moment when your kind of cautious coworker finally buys Bitcoin and instantly morphs into a TikTok macro economist, right? We've all seen it. In model land, that's kind of a feature, not a bug. Now, the self-reinforcing feedback loop could actually push adoption rates beyond that neat 10% bracket, turning conservative into wildly underestimated. So let me kind of sprinkle in some real-world visuals then, because picture a global remittance corridor, say, migrant workers in the UAE sending salaries home to families in India. Right now, that journey hops through correspondent banks like a restless backpacker, racking up fees and delays. Plug XRP in and suddenly that money teleports across borders in literally second flat for a fraction of the cost. If even a slice of the $700 billion daily flow kind of flips over, well, you're essentially kind of supercharging that flywheel. It's the same logic applies to kind of trillion-dollar FX settlements where enterprises kind of crave speed and cost certainty. But there's still a giant elephant tap dancing in the room, and it's regulation, right? Valhil doesn't try to kind of predict courtrooms or political kind of wins, which is wise because that circus kind of tent moves every week. What they do is argue there's that kind of once there's significant clarity in key jurisdictions and once institutions see a regulatory green light, the acceleration could be breathtaking. And that's kind of why, in their model, the 5-year adoption window matters. It's far enough out to allow for legal dominoes to fall, yet close enough that you and I can actually picture it without needing a sci-fi soundtrack. And speaking of soundtracks, I had one of those kind of dramatic movie trailer moments reading the sensitive analysis. You flip a few assumptions, say store of value demand creeps towards a quadrillion because sovereign funds decide to hold a chunk of digital liquidity as a hedge, and suddenly $9,000 per XRP feels less like a moon landing and more like an overseas vacation. Does it feel crazy? Absolutely. But is it kind of mathematically impossible? Well, according to Valhil, not at all. And remember, they're excluding entire asset classes larger than most of us can fathom. And it's kind of like saying we're ranking pizzas, but we're going to ignore pepperoni section. And I can hear, of course, all the skeptical keyboards clacking right now. But what about utility tokens that died a slow death? And true, the graveyard is pretty crowded. Yet XRP's pitch isn't only speed, it's the feedback flywheel. If enough liquidity providers, freelance devs, and CFOs treat XRP like a digital duct tape, then something that you can use every day and stash extra rolls of just in case, the story kind of morphs from hype narrative to infrastructure reality. Now, I know that some of you love the numbers so much that you'd probably tattoo a spreadsheet on your forearm. So here's a quick kind of fire stat reel one more time. $700 billion daily settlement value, 1 second transaction speed, 56.5 billion circulating supply, 10% discount rate, 5-year adoption horizon. Those inputs rolled together with a $530 trillion store of value demand spit out a kind of headliner price. Swap that demand for a $100 trillion buy and you still get $908. Push it to $1 quadrillion and we're looking and talking about $9,000. It kind of feels, at least kind of feel free to kind of pause, of course, and rewind that and let it all kind of sit and marinate to get the kind of full picture. So let me kind of illustrate the kind of victorious kind of cycle in plain English kind of metaphors then, because models, they get dry, right? So imagine that you own a bakery, right? And every weekend, word spreads that your croissants, are unreal. Demand skyrockets, so you rise prices. And because your croissants are now more expensive, customers start hoarding them for, social occasions. Now that hoarding means fewer croissants in the display, which kind of makes them appear, even rarer. So the line outside gets longer. Now that cycle kind of feeds itself until you're essentially printing dough, pun absolutely intended. So in XRP's universe, replace croissants with liquidity and you kind of nailed the gist. But hold your horses. We can't ignore limitations, right? Now Valhil openly states that they can't foresee future use cases. They kind of sidestep derivatives and real estate, and they're not projecting CBDCs, barging in like surprise party guests. The translation here, these numbers can swing wildly in either direction. And well, that's okay. A model is a flashlight, it's not a crystal ball. And here is a quick story that captures my own kind of swing between doubt and belief. 2 years ago, a buddy of mine who kind of builds payment integrations rang me up screaming, "Dude, my client just cut their settlement times from 2 days to 2 seconds using XRP rails." Now he was buzzing like he'd drowned 3 espressos, right? Now that anecdote rattled me because here was a real business, trimming capital inefficiencies overnight. It moved the conversation from theoretical to tangible, and tangibility is the kind of kindling, if you will, in that kind of cycle, or at least what the cycle needs. Okay, so if you're still with me halfway through this epic saga, hats off to your attention span. Now remember, the goal is not to convince you to mortgage your house for XRP. Please don't, right? It's actually just to help you understand how one kind of serious valuation outfit can build a logical tower that reaches the stratosphere. Whether or not reality, ever climbs that tower is, well, another story. But the blueprint in itself is rather fascinating. But this might just shock you. I am not a financial advisor, and nothing in this video is financial advice. Cryptocurrencies are highly volatile, and you could lose all of the money that you invest. You should always do your own research and consult a qualified professional. Your investments are entirely your responsibility, and you should know that nothing is ever guaranteed when it comes to investing. Neither I, this channel, nor YouTube are liable for any losses, and today's video is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Okay, let's circle back to adoption mechanics then, right? 10% of global transactions by 2030 might sound insane until you realize the word, or at least I should say the world, often kind of rewires itself quicker than we actually expect. So let's think about the kind of leap from mail to email, from taxis to ride shares, from printed maps to GPS, right? Once a new technology slices costs and friction, well, I guess the Enetra kind of melts faster than butter in the desert, right? And if XRP meaningfully outperforms traditional rails on speed and cost, well, the path of least resistance could tip adoption scales pretty hard. Now, overlay the psychological element, that's people that love narratives, and digital assets kind of go 1000x, right? Is the kind of sort of headline that even your grandma's kind of bridge club will of course gossip about. Now, the moment that mainstream media kind of picks up on a price rally, like we've seen with Bitcoin before, the feedback loop kind of hits turbo mode. More eyeballs, more buyers, more hodlers, tighter supply, rinse and repeat. Valhil's basically, codifies that psychology into its math. So here's a mental exercise. Close your eyes, not if you're driving, of course, and picture a world where XRP does break past $1,000, right? Companies that kind of hoarded for utility purposes now see capital gains that dwarf their budget savings. Now they kind of brag to their competitors. Competitors scramble to kind of replicate, adoption spikes, and it's not linear, it's viral. Now, of course, every kind of virus has an antidote, right? And here, that antidote is complacency. So if XRPL stopped evolving, it kind of, if its fees maybe spiked, if governance fractured, well, the flywheel could potentially grind to a halt. But so far, the ledger has been, quietly iterating new hooks, sidechains, and growing dev toolkits. Whether that kind of pace is enough to outrun rivals remain the kind of $1 million or $9,000 question. Now, because I refuse to kind of let you walk away without, practical nuggets, here's how I, personally kind of sanity check moonshot models like this. 1, I print the kind of key assumptions and pin them above my desk. 2, I check real-world progress every quarter. Are remittance corridors actually flipping on? Is liquidity deepening? And 3, right, I kind of recalibrate position sizes so that even if, all kind of projections fall flat, my financial house stays intact. It's boring, maybe. Is it essential? Absolutely. And if you want to kind of track these metrics in real time, remember that free educational Discord server that I mentioned earlier? Well, we've got a channel dedicated to these kind of things where members can drop their on-chain stats, adoption headlines, and regulatory updates. It's like having a kind of 50 extra kind of pairs of eyes scanning the horizon so that you don't have to refresh Twitter every single minute. Okay, let's talk about the narrative climax and the part where our kind of metaphorical flywheel hits the escape velocity. So picture a huge global bank, maybe one of the top 5, announcing that XRPL is now the backbone of its treasury settlements. Now that single kind of press release could do more for price acceleration than a year of grassroots anything. Because in finance, reputational risk is the kind of nastiest 4-letter word, right? And once a kind of blue chip jumps first, well, the rest rush in so that they don't look outdated. Now, if that domino falls in the next 5 years, well, Valhil's adoption timeline suddenly feels conservative rather than daring. Now, before we wrap up, quick nod to Blowfin once again. If you're exploring buying or selling XRP, poke around their platform with that affiliate link that's in the description. They've got transparent fees, a pretty nifty UI, and yes, the link helps the channel cover production costs so that I can keep my hair from going full, Einstein while reading white papers at, 2 a.m. Okay, let's land the plane, right? Valhil Capital's model here kind of paints a future where XRP morphs from fast payments plumbing to bona fide digital vault. Now, they slice the mechanics into adoption sparks, pricing feedback, and a self-reinforcing store of value loop. Even after carving out, entire mega markets like derivatives, they still arrive at jaw-dropping valuations. Could they be wrong? Totally. Could they be right or even underestimating? Well, stranger things have happened. Just ask anyone who bought Bitcoin at $10. So, what are my key takeaways? Well, you got 1. Exponential curves defy intuition, right? You got to pay attention to flywheels here. It's not just straight lines. 2, value a kind of narrative as much as a kind of spreadsheet sell. Adoption stories move faster when they feel personal and inevitable. 3, models are roadmaps, not contracts. Update them as the terrain shifts.